Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Kaplan, and I am the director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies here at the University of Texas at Austin. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the first of this year's lectures in the Kasman Family Lectures in Eastern European Jewish Life and Culture. The Kasman Lecture, which is supported by a generous endowment from the Kasman family, is designed to support critical scholarship at the University of Texas on Eastern European Jewish life and culture. This year, the Kasman Lecture Committee, which consists of myself, Dr. Tatiana Lichtenstein, Dr. Mary Newberger, and Dr. Stephen Siegel, have decided to focus the lecture series on the Jews of Ukraine. Before I welcome Dr. Siegel to introduce today's speaker, I would like to thank our former Administrative Associate, Sabalin Arden, as well as our current Administrative Associate, Karen Marco, for their assistance in organizing this lecture, as well as the event's many co-sponsors. These include the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, the Center for European Studies, and the Department of History. One last word about Q&A. To begin, I would like to thank my colleague, Dr. Marina Alexandrova, for her assistance with translation during the Q&A time at the end of the lecture. Though we are using a Zoom webinar for the lecture portion of this event, we will, at the end of the lecture, elevate everyone to panelist status during the Q&A to allow for a more robust conversation. At this time, I would like to welcome my colleague, Dr. Stephen Siegel, to introduce our speaker for the day.
Thank you, Jonathan, and welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon in Austin. I'm Stephen Siegel, and I'm the Associate Chair here in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies and at the UT Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. So today, it's a great pleasure to have my friend and colleague, Dr. Artem Kharchenko, joining us. He is the Associate Professor at the Department of Ukrainian Studies at the National Technical University, at the Department of the Social Sciences and University of Arts, both in Kharkiv, where we met in 2019. He's a lecturer on the history of the Holocaust at the University Partnership Claims Conference and co-founder of the NGO, I think this is a remarkable thing, the Center for Interethnic Relations in the Research of Eastern Europe. Since the escalated war started in February of 2022, Artem has a scholarship at the Center for Urban History in Lviv, where he's participating in projects for documenting war experiences in Ukraine. Dr. Kharchenko is currently working on a monograph entitled Jewish Community Within the Space of an Imperial City, 1859 to 1917, about which he'll speak today. His research offers an outlook on Jewish population in the south of the Russian Empire beyond the Pale of Settlement. The research focuses on the issue of internal Jewish migration, relations of Jewish populations with imperial authorities, and the diversity of the region's Jewish communities. Artem studied history at Kharkiv National University of Kharkiv, where he taught and defended his candidate thesis on the history of families in the Kharkiv region in the 19th century, completing his project called The System of Orphanages in Soviet Ukraine in the Holodomor period, 1920 to 1935. Finally, I'll mention Dr. Kharchenko has participated in education programs internationally in the US, France, and Germany, and he's been a guest researcher at the Simon Dubnow Institute in Leipzig, the New European College in Bucharest, and Hebrew University in Jerusalem. It's a great pleasure, Artem, to have you here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for introducing me. And hello, everyone. Greetings from Ukraine, and thanks for your coming. Glad to see you, even in Zoom. And first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Dr. Kaplan and Karen Marco, who permanently assisted me, offered me their help. And I would like to thank all the staff of the Center of European Studies of the University of Texas at Austin, and many organizations who supported the event. It's really honor for me, and it's very value for me. And also I'm grateful to my friends and colleagues, Professor Kulikov and Professor Sigal again, who brought the opportunity to my attention. And before I talk about the topics that I proposed, I should tell you about what this theme is related to. And I have several slides for presentation. One moment. Several slides for beginning of my presentation. One. Okay. You see it? Yes?
Yes, we can see the slides, Artem.
Thank you. And this topic is part of my future book. And I had planned to complete the draft this December, but circumstances forced me to postpone this plan to next year. And how Stephen mentioned, the draft title of my book, A Jewish Community in the Space of the Imperial City, 1859-1917. And I have several important points that are decisive for my research. First is the history of the Jews in the Russian Empire outside the Pale of Settlement. Secondly, this is an attempt to tell a story not about Jewish elites or about successful Jews who found themselves beyond the Pale. And first of all, I am interested in the south of the empire, and this is connected with the general processes, social and economic, that took place there. Also, Kharkiv is an important focus for me, but not everything. And further, I will explain why this is so. And so I bring to your attention main focuses of my research. Slide 1, yes. Jews in the period of the late Imperial Russia, Jews outside the Pale of Settlement, Jews in the south of Russian Empire, Jews in Imperial City, a story that includes more than Jewish elites. And the next slide, a table, no, excuse me, my story has 3 parts, and look at the second slide about main topics of my research. And first of all, this is the theme of migration, the second relationship with authorities, and third, community inside or hidden community.
Artem, your slides are not advancing.
Excuse me?
Could you move your slides forward because your slides are not advancing?
Now?
We're still seeing slide number 1.
Aha, okay.
Do you want to try to stop your share and reshare again?
I tried to do it. You see the table?
No, we don't. Let me go ahead and see if I can. There we go. Yeah.
Okay. It's not so important.
Why don't you try to share again and see if that works?
What's now?
Now it's working.
Super. And first, it's a story about internal Jewish migration. And this is an important point since in the second half of the 20th century, migration was the main condition for the growth of large cities in the south of the empire, such as Kharkiv. And migration was a reason that created numerous communities in cities beyond the pale of settlement. And we try to define who were these migrants and why did they choose Kharkiv. And using the information, we created a map of migration, which presented the main flows, the locations which became a source of migration, and metropolises Kharkiv, Kyiv, Odessa, Yekaterinslav, which became the end point or transit point of the movement of migrants from the Pale and beyond it. On this migration map, Kharkiv was one of the points. The city has never been such a dream for migrants as Odessa, and enthusiastic memories have not been written about it. But the Kharkiv gave jobs, and with the advent of the railway, it was easy to come there. And so Kharkiv became the choice for many Jews, at least for a while. And please, next slide to concern this issue. And you see the growth, the population of the city and the rise of Jewish population for several decades, since 1859 to 1970. And next slide. Yes. A table that shows the numbers as a percentage of the total number of migrants in a certain period from certain territories. I divided all the period. I choose two parts. And I also tried to study the social structure of migrants and their motivation. What segments of the population migrated? What became their main motive? Economy, the search for a better life, or social freedom, the impossibility of social growth in the established form of traditional communities? And what could attract a migrant to the city, and what could push it away? And also, can we consider Jewish migrants as agents of modernization who preferred new professions like stockbrokers or becoming a lawyer, or was their occupation part of the economy of a traditional society? The second part of my research is a story about the relationship between the authorities and the Jewish population. And I tried to define three categories of authorities. Firstly, this is the Imperial Center, St. Petersburg, its ministries, which adopted the main decrees and formed the general framework of policy towards the Jews. The second level is the governor's administration, which concentrated administrative and military power in their hand. The governors acted as intermediaries in solving certain problems. They were approached with requests by Jewish subjects in many cases. And the third level is the city authorities, city self-government bodies, police, courts. They were interacted with the Jewish population on everyday life. And I try to describe the interaction between all levels of authorities. And in fact, it's not about a monolith, but about often competing bodies and sometimes opposing each other. Here, I would like to show you those books that were significant for me during the work with the second part of my research. And first of all, the classic, the work of John Clear, but also Anti-Jewish Violence and Shtetl, the Golden Age. But also I will mention other brilliant works. And we try to give answers to important issues. How was the Jewish question formed and formulated, in particular regarding the presence of the Jewish population according to the internal borders established by the authorities, the Pale of Settlement? What were the patterns of behavior among the Jewish population in interactions with the authorities? And how might the model of the relation between the empire and its Jewish subjects in the city, region, beyond the boundaries of the Pale of Settlement be described? And the answers to this question reflect the contradictory nature of the imperial policy and the variety of reactions of the Jewish population in relation to different decisions and its implementation. And my report today will be close to precisely this issue, but I will back to this later. And now about the third part of my research, the focus is on the Jewish community of Kharkiv. And I'm trying to describe how over the long period of the 19th century and the first decades of 20th century, the Jewish community emerged and grew. By the way, right now I have received support from the Department of Jewish Studies from Wroclaw, and I will be able to be at the Center for Urban History in Lviv for the next 6 months to finish the chapter of my book, this last chapter. And I have identified several periods that we'll write about. First, the formation of community whose members were soldiers and merchants. Second, when migration created a new community. And third, a period of certain stabilization when the growth of the Jewish population continued, but the community was quite stable. For me, there are several important points in this part. First, which I have already mentioned, is a story about those who did not belong to the Jewish elites. When Nathan Mayer or Benjamin Nathans described the Jewish population of Kiev and St. Petersburg, they noted that many Jews were left out of their attention. The reason is quite clear. The problem with the sources. I tried to write about those who were illegal or partially legal. Also, I wrote about those who lived quite legally, but were involved in practices that formally violated the laws of the empire. Thus, I discovered what I call the hidden community. It was a full-fledged Jewish community with all its social institutions and practices that existed in Kharkiv, a city that was beyond the Pale of Settlement, even at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Another important point is to show that the Jewish population was also not a monolith. In a period of rapid growth, active migration, one can observe permanent conflicts and clashes. The new migrants blamed the old community for losing the real tradition, and later new migrants tried to fight the rules that the community set. Finally, a very important story: what were the relations between the Jews and the non-Jewish population in the city? The growing Jewish presence in the city was noted by contemporaries. Representatives of non-Jewish people find different answers to the perception of this fact. Jews might be perceived as normal neighbors, competitors, or as a threat to the welfare of non-Jewish society. These views often appeared in the press, remained in the memories, appeared in public debate. Sources let us talk about the way ordinary people perceive and use the usual stereotypes and vocabulary of the Jewish question. And as a result, I'm going to write this book in Ukrainian, and this book should play its role in my Ukrainian career. But I already have an idea, and 2 days ago at the Center for Urban History that I mentioned, we discussed a modified project that could work out like, I don't know, about like a postdoc. And next spring, I would like to think about where I can apply this project for 1 or 2 years, and I try to publish text for journals in English. But now, with your permission, I will return to the topic I have stated. Before I mentioned that the topic is close to the second part of my research, but it's really important to the whole book. I consider this plot as an important theoretical and methodological part, so I would like to discuss it with you. And for me, this is a new plot, which has not yet been reflected in the text, but for the last 2 years, I have been thinking about it. So when John Clear once wondered if at the end of the 19th century, Russian Empire's journalists wrote about Jewish life as terra incognita, how mysterious was it for imperial officials when they first met? And we offered a new formulation of the question, how were the imperial officials so well informed about their Jewish subjects, as well as what were the strategies of Jewish behavior in communicate with representatives of the state. And the aim of my research is to study the perception, knowledge of the imperial bureaucracy regarding Jews in the 1840s and 1850s. The period chosen is important for understanding both the previous and subsequent policy of the imperial government towards Jewish subjects. In particular, with regard to the policy of merger, слияние, started in 1859, the individual emancipation of Jews with permission to leave the Pale of Settlement. And we argue that the government officials in St. Petersburg were informed about the Jewish question much more than the researchers wrote about it. Accordingly, certain decisions of the Imperial Center were made in close contact with representatives of the authorities on the periphery. In the same period, we observed a specific discourse regarding the Jews, which was established in the environment of the imperial bureaucracy, which was Orientalist and racist. And we believe that this period was a transitional between the traditional Judophobia and the emergence of modern anti-Semitism. Another important question is how relationship between the Jewish community and the authorities evolved during the period when the policy of merger of 1859-1881 was replaced by a policy of discrimination. The context of this permanent relationship was a competition of national projects in the south of the empire, Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, and Jews, in particular in Kharkiv, as well as the birth of modern phenomenon, anti-Semitism. What did the authorities know about their subjects, and on the basis of what did they form their policy in the Jewish question? Actually, our research is an attempt to analyze the ideas, knowledge of the imperial authorities regarding their Jewish subjects, on the basis of which the policy was conducted. An important focus of the new imperial history approach is communication between the center and periphery of the imperial bureaucracy. An important point to achieve is the attempt to apply the methodology and terminology of post-colonial studies. The problem of relations between the Jewish population and the authorities in the Russian Empire is an classical literature plot, perhaps one of the central ones in Jewish studies. And from the classic works of Simon Dubnow and decades ahead, the idea of an empire that initiated anti-Jewish violence and legislative pogroms was established. In this opposition, the Jewish population was presented as a passive victim who was left with the path of acculturation and refusal of political struggle. But in the middle of the 20th century, a rethinking of the concept, which Salo Baron characterized as the Lacrimosa conception of Jewish history, began. And later in the studies of Jonathan Frankel, Elio Lederhandler, Israel Bartal, the imperial policy was no longer limited to repressive actions, and the behavior strategies of the Jewish population appeared to be more diverse than the passive adoption of authoritative decisions. The main source of the research was bureaucracy documentation, correspondence of provincial offices, city government bodies with central departments, ministries, the Senate, the Imperial Council. Among the array of documents are requests from central departments, responses received to this request, instructions to governors regarding certain issues related to the Jewish population. These documents are stored both in Ukrainian archives, in particular in the Central State Historical Archives of Ukraine, and also in the state archives of the Chernihiv, Kharkiv region, other region in Ukraine, and also in the Central Archives for the history of the Jewish people, and in the Central Zionist Archives in Jerusalem, as well as in the Russian State Historical Archive in St. Petersburg. My work in the archives made it possible to discover documents created by the central departments of the empire, which are often kept in Ukrainian archives only in the form of reactions answers. And in the first half of the 19th century, the central government of the empire sent requests to the regions to provide information on the population and economy, and local officials carefully collected the necessary information, established contacts with representatives of Jewish communities and other informants. As a result, the high bureaucracy of the empire was informed about the organization of Jewish communities, the socio-economic models of their existence, and religious branches within Judaism. In the middle of the 19th century, the Minister of Internal Affairs, Count Pavel Kiselyov, was sent a note about the Hasidic sect. This note is one of a set of documents that reveals to us the vicissitudes of immersion of imperial officials in the relations of various branches of Judaism. The minister was informed that the Hasidim have been under surveillance for a long time, and officials of Jewish origin were present among the informants. Probably this was the so-called Vykristi, persons who converted to Orthodoxy, live in Judaism. However, information was also provided by people who directly represented Jewish communities, representatives of the Jewish elite, but not only, rabbis and other persons. The documents contain different versions submitted by informants, which potentially gave the high bureaucracy the opportunity to see a more complex picture. The report was accompanied by a historical reference. for example, which named the founder of Hasidism, Baal Shem Tov, Israel Ben Eliezer, defined the area of spread of the current, in particular mentioned the Volyn province and Galicia, noted an important role of tzaddiks. Pavel Ignatiev, Governor General of Vilna, Mogilov, and Smolensk, had the opportunity to read an even more informative reference about the history of Hasidism and its spiritual leader. Without a doubt, the authorship of this reference does not belong to a supporter of Hasidism, and the best is mentioned as an ignorant and even weak Talmudist, but an excellent charlatan. His practices are characterized as tricks, and the success of preaching in the Podilsk province is explained by rude and uneducated people. Another characteristic given to the Hasids has a specified also, the Yekaterinoslav Rebbe, and he was invited to assess the loyalty of the Hasids to the state. And his conclusions were particularly negative. In particular, accusing the tzaddiks of calls to disobey orders and not to pray for sovereigns. Officials in the regions analyzed the state's policy on the issue of religious contradictions in the Jewish community and gave it an assessment. Thus, one of the documents describes the policy of Minister Dmitry Bludov in the 1830s. And an official from the Volyn province explained that the refusal to persecute the Hasids at that time was determined by the reluctance to side with another branch, traditional Rabbinic Judaism. That is, the authorities denied Judaism as well and were not going to side with one of the religious groups. The official also emphasized the actual failure of the state reform, which was supposed to give control over Jewish communities through the Institute of Crown Rabbis created in 1835. The official concluded that the spiritual rabbis are active despite the ban, and the crown rabbis don't play any role. In 1843, a representative of the Jewish community of the Radomyshl district reported to the Kyiv provincial office that Hasidic rabbis were practicing in his area. The reports were not limited to information about Hasidism. The documents mentioned the discussions of the medieval French spiritual leader of Judaism, Rashi, and indicated the importance of the experience of the integration Jewish community of Berlin with Moses Mendelssohn. The report from the regions are informative, with mentions of the peculiarities of Ashkenazic and Sephardic prayer books, stories about Shchita, with an emphasis on the importance of the thickness of knife blades, and descriptions of various forms of tefillin. Informants introduced officials to the Jewish religious calendar, mentioning Rosh Hashanah, Sukkot, and Pesach, and reported details of the practices of the tzaddiks. The documents contain many descriptions of what the informants presented as superstitions of the Jewish population, such as the belief in the healing powers of the tzaddik laws. The relationship between the authorities and Jewish subjects was not one-sided. Using the example of the Yekaterinoslav Rebbe's report, we see how the Jewish community tries to use power in its internal competition with Hasidic tzaddiks, trying to maintain control over payments for religious services. Moreover, in the event of potential danger, Jewish communities united in search of a compromise. Thus, in 1852, the Rabbinical Commission was created under the Ministry of Internal Affairs which was supposed to give an opinion on Hasidism. Probably the reaction of the government was assist as a threat to all Jewish communities, and as a result, the Hasidim themselves became the chairman and one of the members of the commission. And the commission's conclusions explained that Hasidism is only a theological school and not a sect. The activities of tzaddiks are harmless to morality and public peace, and moral religious should be preferred to police measures. Currently, it is difficult to say about the mechanisms of selection of informants from the Jewish environment. One of the evidence of their importance in this particular period is the appearance of the Institute of Jewish Scholars, in particular as advisors to the governors general in the Pale. The informant could be a so-called crown rabbi, and probably for their own reasons, any representative of the Jewish community could submit the necessary data. In particular, we see such a plot in the religious conflicts of Jewish communities, when the opponents of Hasidism carefully communicated to the authorities, probably more than they could understand. Awareness did not at all mean benevolence of the imperial bureaucracy towards Jewish subjects. On the one hand, the imperial authorities, in the spirit of the Enlightenment, felt themselves to be social engineers, and in their eyes, the transformation of the Jewish population did not offer from other social projects of the empire. On the other hand, through the documents, it is possible to observe the formation of a discourse that we consider Orientalist and was different from what John Clear or Israel Bartal called the traditional Orthodox intolerance toward the Jews. In the end, such views became part of the justification for part of the imperial establishment, which promoted the idea of the impossibility of integrating Jews into Russian society. Discursive practices formed in the first half of the 19th century, which are reflected in official documents and did not give a Jew the opportunity to become a natural citizen with a change of religious affiliation. The document on improving the life of Jews in the Western provinces in 1843 mentions Jewish women who have accepted baptism in an Orientalist spirit, and making us recall the meeting of Gustave Flaubert and Kuchuk Hanem, quote, feebly by their gender, weak by their breed, but hot in their temperament, prone to the most vile, shameless debauchery. As we can see, conversion to orthodoxy from the official's point of view did not cancel the otherness of a Jewish woman. An 1850 document describes Jewish clothing as Oriental, despite the fact that it refers to Kiev, Podilsk, and Volyn provinces. The poverty of the local Jewish population is explained by the luxury in clothing, apparently characteristic of the Jewish community, poverty and economic decline, next to women's silk dresses, men's fur coats, gold and silver jewelry, precious stones, a typical technique for Orientalist descriptions. It is difficult to deny that at various levels of the imperial bureaucracy, the persons responsible for the policy regarding Jewish subjects were sufficiently well informed about the social or cultural, primarily religious characteristic of the Jewish communities. Communication on these issues between different levels of government, from local representatives to ministerial offices, was permanent. repeatedly created special committees to which representatives of the highest imperial bureaucracy belonged, are direct evidence of the importance of the Jewish question for the empire. Officials involved representatives of Jewish communities in the creation of reports and tried to gather the positions of various groups. Likewise, Jewish representatives could be involved in resolving controversial issues, including conflicts between different religious branches. In the perception of their Jewish subjects, the representatives of the ruling circles of the empire demonstrated what can be read as othering, the strong basis of which in the first half of the 19th century was Judaism, but the formation of practices that can be described as Orientalist and racist, where the Jew is a foreigner and Eastern man with inherent features in behavior, clothing, social and economic models of existing, which cannot be changed by religious transition. In the middle of the 19th century, that part of the political establishment obviously won, which tried to use the experience of acculturation of the Jewish community in Berlin, which was familiar to the officials, by attracting as allies those who professed Haskalas ideas. From 1859, the empire began a policy that Nathans describes as selective integration. The top imperial officials seemed to know enough about the problems of their Jewish subjects, whom they wanted to convert through proper organization and inculcation of responsibility, the lack of which was emphasized by Jewish informants in the reports of their subordinates. Despite the utopian nature of this approach, the question of Jewish emancipation seemed for several decades to be the correct answer to the Jewish question. An important problem of research forces us to repeat the question posed by Gayatri Spivak: can the subalterns, in our case the Jews, speak? In all the above cases, when the representatives of the Jewish communities were given the floor, the Ekaterinoslav Rebbe or the Volynburger only spoke to an official who had the authority to interpret their words. Even in this way, one can read certain behavioral strategies, understand what was important to them or what they wanted to hide. But this certainly does not eliminate the feeling of missing an important fragment. And now I'm trying to create a collective portrait of such informants to propose a hypothesis about their motivations. Their individual histories should provide information for this, but an important problem for my research is the lack of ego documents. Also, sometimes they can be found quite unexpectedly. Here I would like to return again to my final stage of my research, which I presented early. The main answer, it seems to me, is that the Jewish population was not a monolith, and often we see rivalry going on inside, and sometimes certain participants attracted the authorities to their side. But basically, this ended in a compromise, as we said about this in the case of conflict between rabbis and Hasidism. I'm finished. Thank you for your attention.
Fabulous, Artem. Thank you so much for that wonderful lecture. We'll go ahead and, Karen, if you can go ahead and bring everyone into the conversation as a panelist, that would be wonderful. And I will, Artem, would you like to field your own questions as folks come in, or would you like me to handle that? So everyone should be receiving an invitation to be elevated to be a panelist. So please go ahead and click that on to say yes and to join in the main room. And then as folks come in and they would like to ask a question, if they would just go ahead and open their video and pose their question. I think Greg Lipscomb, you have the first question of the day. If you've got one.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to show up, but
yeah, no, you're fine. You're fine.
I do, as I got from the very fine lecture, the experience or opportunity or even the option of assimilation, or as you said, integration into Russian society just wasn't there. And compared to, say, the American experience, there were just too many factors against it. And I guess there would, from what you say, there just was there no effort to sort of Russianize somewhat, or get stable the radar and become a participant, or was it just under siege all the time?
Would you like me to translate the question?
Yes, if you can help me, please. I didn't catch.
Sure. I think the
sense.
question was, был вопрос о возможности ассимиляции, и была ли такая возможность при царском правительстве, и были ли какие-то усилия приложены для руссифицирования еврейского населения? Я так поняла вопрос.
If I can, I get my answer in Russian. If you don't mind, sorry. Насколько я это понимаю, да, то есть никакого устоявшегося проекта национального, к которому следовало бы приобщить евреев в этот период, да, и даже в более поздний, просто не существовало.
Do you mind? Можно я буду переводить кусочек? So at this point, there was no unified project to как руссифицировать, да?
Russification?
Да, to russify, Russianize Jewish population in the Russian Empire.
То есть у нас нет русского национализма как идеи до фактически, насколько я понимаю, для имперских чиновников до последней трети XIX века.
So Russian nationalism was not a kind of national agenda before the last third of the 19th century.
И когда, например, я вспоминаю, да, украинское, например, да, национальный проект, когда Алексей Миллер писал о украинском вопросе, то он как бы сетовал в своей книге, что вот мы не имели той экономики Франции, чтобы ассимилировать украинцев. И то же самое действовало в отношении евреев, как мне кажется.
So he's talking about the Ukrainian national project and the work of Alexei Miller. Alexei Miller. So he was lamenting the fact that there was no economy of France to kind of assimilate, right? Is that чтобы помочь ассимилировать Украину?
Не-не-не, то есть французский проект ассимиляционный, да, для Прованса или Британии, он сработал. А Российская империя не имела такой экономики, чтобы повторить это со своими подданными.
Yeah, so the Russian economy could not repeat the same experiment that was conducted in France, for example, because economically there was just it wasn't possible.
Другое дело, что определенный период сами евреи, да, некоторые евреи, они хотели, да, ассимилироваться, они об этом говорили.
But on the other hand, some Jews wanted to assimilate, and they talked about that.
И именно поэтому для них 81 год, да, вот эта вот волна антиеврейского насилия, она стала таким разочарованием.
And that's why for them, the wave of anti-Jewish violence of 1881 was such a disappointment to them.
То есть снова мой ответ, наверное, такой, что были чиновники, которые этого хотели, но они не имели для этого возможности. Были евреи, которые этого тоже хотели, но это закончилось провалом в силу разных причин. Да?
So to sum it up, he says there was some statesmen who did want to undertake this project, but just didn't have the resources. And there were some Jews who wanted to get assimilated, but there was a complete failure because of these events.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you.
I believe Dr. Tatiana Lichtenstein had the next question.
Hi, Artem. Thank you so much for your talk. I have two questions that are separate but also related. So first, I would like to go back to some of your overview of your research on Kharkiv. I'm interested in this question of these cities and Jewish communities emerging, or Jewish societies emerging outside of the Pale. Can you talk more about who are the different people that are allowed or not allowed? Like, who basically are they? Some of them are legal, right? And some of them are illegal. Can you talk, like, flesh out a bit more? Who are these people? What kind of Jewish institutions? Like, one of the things I'm thinking about, for instance, is when they went to court, like, what happened, you know, what court system did they live under, these people, right? Or is that actually, once they interact with the Russian court system, is that where you see them basically in your research? So that's my first question. If you could just talk more about this migration and what is the push and pull and who are these people? And the second question is, this informant, your study of these informants, I think is absolutely fascinating and really, really interesting. And I can also see how complicated it is, but rich, right? And so I'm interested. So a lot of the questions that, the sources you talked about were, for instance, the development with the tension between Hasidim and non-Hasidim. What about in the cities? Like, did the informants also operate in the cities? Did they also kind of provide information about urban, like really urban, I mean, bigger cities, urban Jewish life to the government? Or were these really ones that were out in small towns and villages and sort of what we traditionally sort of associate more with Hasidim, right? And so the last question is related to the informants too, is, could you give an example? It sounds like you have found ego documents for some of these informants. Can you give an example of one of these? It would be very interesting to hear more about any of these people. Thank you.
Thank you. And excuse me, I used Russian again. Russian language, I mean. Okay.
Да, вопрос был о еврейских общинах,
Да,
да?
я понял. Да. Если я понял правильно, да, первый вопрос о том, кто, да, были эти люди
и как они селились,
каким образом, да, они оказались. То есть, чтобы объяснить, мне сразу надо сказать, что вот этот, да, понимание довольно старого, да, направления новой имперской истории, оно нам на самом деле говорит о том, что следует внимательно смотреть на разные регионы империи, в том числе на ее юг, на украинские земли. И мы видим, что здесь, даже там, где, казалось бы, черта не дает возможности евреям присутствовать, она не работала никогда.
So he talks about how we need to pay attention to the new imperial history of Russia and look at the regions. And he's saying that the Pale of settlement didn't really work in the southern regions or in the territory of Ukraine.
То есть Харьковский регион, да, вот это так называемая Слобода Украины, она имела свое особенное устройство.
The Kharkiv region had its own setup or organizational setup.
Да, она была интегрирована уже в XVIII веке, но еще с того момента фактически мы видим, что в Харькове есть еврейское население, и оно официально там есть. И это как бы противоречит закону империи, но оно там есть.
So he said it was integrated officially from the 18th century, but technically the laws didn't work because the settlements would be unlawful there, right?
И да, такой литератор, да, Аксаков, он, например, писал о украинских ярмарках в середине XIX века. И он упоминает многочисленных евреев на харьковских ярмарках, а официальные документы говорят о многих тысячах евреев в городе.
So he talks about how one of the writers, Aksakov, writes about fairs where Jewish were present in Kharkiv region and how there were thousands and thousands of Jews living in that area.
И очень интересно, что один из доходов городского бюджета – это позволить определенным лицам готовить еду этим евреям приезжающим. И мы можем допустить, что это кошерная еда, но тогда ее должен готовить кто-то, кто может иметь на это право, да? И вот тогда мы видим, что, скорее всего, это там жены солдат гарнизона.
So he says that there's a very interesting historical document that there's a line of or stream of revenue for local budgets was the licenses for the cooks to provide food for the Jewish merchants. And so we think that, or he thinks that it could be wives of the officers stationed there, quartered there. So it's definitely.
Thank you. И затем мы с 1859 года, в Харькове уже в 1858 году принято решение допускать евреев, купцов первой гильдии в город. Но для меня вот это вот то, что на это называют селективной интеграцией. Я немного иронично отношусь к этому, потому что это только об идеях, а эти идеи были просто иллюзиями, они никогда не работали. Селективная интеграция.
So he talks about how as early as 1858 and 1859 Jewish merchants were officially recognized, как бы сказать, их они могли продавать товары или
Нет, там смысл в том, что определенным категориям, которые государство признает полезными, разрешается переезжать за черту оседлости.
Okay, so they officially were allowed to move beyond the Pale of Settlement. And he talks about selective integration, the notion of selective integration, but he doesn't really agree with it. He says that ideas were one thing, but then the practices were different.
И почему я считаю практически, что это не работало? Да, я буквально пару лет я работал с материалами судов и полиции. И они дают просто огромнейший материал, который показывает, например, да, вот только один момент. Каждый месяц в городе проходят полицейские облавы. И они каждый раз на базарах находят десятки людей, которые нелегально проживают в городе.
So he says that he spent about 2 years working with court and police documents, and they give you the wealth of information of actually what was going on in the city. And they would do police would do the raids in the marketplace, and they would find dozens of people living in the city illegally.
И также есть очень много каких-нибудь жалоб, да, внимательных горожан, которые говорят, вот у этого купца очень много, а каждый купец имел право на десяток, да, своих приказчиков и слух единоверцев. Вот у этого купца проживает много нелегальных евреев. Проходит проверка, они действительно есть.
And he also talks about how looking at the citizen complaints is really helpful, because the people will say that, well, this specific merchant has too many of people working for him from the same faith. So they're allowed to have 10, сколько, 10, можно было там несколько,
Да.
but he has too many.
Дюжина, да.
Yeah. They were allowed to have a dozen of people working for them, but the neighbors, I guess, соседи жаловались, да? Citizen complained about too many of the...
И какие результаты? Да, их выселили, этих людей? Часто нет. То есть власть, на самом деле что-то происходит, и власть не реагирует.
And he says that what are the outcomes? Are they evicted or not? And for the most part, they were not evicted, and the complaints were filed, but there were no action from the government.
И я могу уверенно сказать, что вот в целом за период я таких людей нашел, несколько тысяч буквально. То есть на самом деле, когда официально говорится о 10 тысячах проживающих согласно результатам первой переписи, я уверен, что их число было минимум в 1,5 раза больше.
He says that he found information on десятки тысяч, вы сказали, или просто тысячи?
Было 10 тысяч, 9 тысяч, там почти 10 тысяч.
Information on 9, almost 10,000 people, but he says that it's safe to assume that there was probably в 2 раза больше, наверное, да, вы сказали?
Да.
Probably double the size that actually lived there.
И это иронично, но вот харьковские антисемиты, они были правы. То есть евреев в городе было действительно гораздо больше, чем об этом говорила перепись.
And he says, ironically, anti-Semites were right, so there were many more Jews in the city than the official documents showed.
Но дело в том, что это не только про евреев, да? Сами правила проживания в городе, они были настолько строги, что нелегальных мигрантов в городе было огромное количество. То есть буквально половина города не имела документов от полиции с разрешением жить в Харькове. И это не только про евреев.
And he says it doesn't concern Jews only. The rules of the dwelling in the city were so strict that a lot of people were on illegal status. They didn't have the documents to legally dwell in the city.
Stephen, do you have a comment?
No, I
had
didn't
a
have
s-
oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Tatiana, please.
Okay,
I just
I
wanted
remember
to
about
ask, I just
your-
wanted to ask you about the ego documents again, because I know I asked a lot
Okay,
too much,
I
but if you could give
remember.
one example, that would be
Мгм.
great.
Просто как пример, да, и вот того, что я говорил, что иногда это совершенно неожиданно. Я работал просто по просьбе, да, своего друга и консультанта моей работы в сионистском архиве и работал с фондом, наверное, знакомого, да, вам Йосефа Трумпельдора, участника русско-японской войны и деятеля сионизма. И вот совершенно неожиданно его адресатам, да, женщины в Харькове, они так полноценно рассказывают о жизни в городе. Да, и вот я узнаю о том, как там, что и происходит вот в еврейской общине города в это время, во время Первой мировой войны позже. То есть вот такие вот, но это вот всегда случайные находки. К сожалению, за весь период с эго-документами огромная проблема.
So he says that some of the findings were accidental, and he says that looking at the fonts of Trubildor, the collection,
Йосиф Трумпельдор.
Trubildor, he found some personal letters from women of Kharkiv in which they tell him about the Jewish dwellers in the city.
Ну, они говорят о своей жизни, да, но получается мы
They talk
видим...
about, yeah, their own life, but turns out to, or they happen to talk about more things than just their private lives.
Но с чем еще особенно, да, моя проблема? Может, это звучит так самонадеянно, но я, наоборот, пытаюсь писать именно о тех, кто фактически, скорее всего, не мог оставить никаких эго-документов.
It might sound a bit arrogant, but I'm trying to write about people who couldn't leave any documents or any memories.
То есть я не хочу писать об известных Рубинштейнах или о Бурасах. Я хочу писать о тех, кто почти не виден. И в этом я вижу как бы важный элемент своего исследования.
So he wants to talk about people, not famous people, not like the Rubinsteins and others, but those who didn't leave much trace in history.
I think our next question is from Stephen Siegel, or our last question for the evening or the afternoon, perhaps.
Thank you for a great talk. I'm going to keep this short and I'll ask it in English for the audience. I've been thinking about what you said of intermediaries. I think this is a really important historical and historiographical intervention. I see the role of intermediaries later on in the 20th century in Jewish history. And I think, of course, of the Judenraten. So I'm imagining a different bureaucratic scenario in the empire where these informants are working with a lot of different communities. So the informants have to be aware of the police. They, it would seem, have to know their numbers. So they have to know relative demography, the number of Jews and the number of synagogues in Sloboda, Ukraine, right? So they're looking and seeing like states, but they're also looking from below, from the Kehillah, right? They're looking from the community. And so here's my question for you about your sources. I'm in complete agreement with you that the Jewish population is not a monolith. I think this is really important. What I want to see in the personal documents, what Tatiana is mentioning, the ego documents, is the specific regional imprint. And by that, I mean the almost like Kharkiv dialect, raklol, when you know what it means, right? So raklol means that you're actually not just talking about Jewish populations, but Roma populations, Romani populations, other minorities relative to other subalterns. There might be a plural number of subalterns in the way that we're thinking about agency. And I think the question that you're raising is a really important modernity question. My big question that I see from you is, when is that transition from imperial Orientalism to modern racism and modern anti-Semitism completed? In Sloboda Ukraina, it would seem it would have to be during the 1880s. I mean, completed is a really strong word because we have the May laws, we have Ignatieff, the role of Ignatieff in places like Bulgaria. But I guess the long way of the way to shorten this is to say, when specifically in Sloboda Ukraina, among the Kharkiv Jews, do you see this kind of turn toward a more exclusionary nationalism, anti-Semitism, racism? Because I think that's a big political question. And it's hard to answer that question without looking from above at all the governors and all of the mayors and all of the power hierarchy. So there's this great tension in your work that I love, because in reading it, I see you as a social historian answering political questions.
Спасибо за вопрос. Попытаюсь ответить. То есть еще один, наверное, пробел моего исследования. Я всегда мало внимания уделяю политическим вопросам.
One of the lacunas in his research doesn't pay enough attention to the political questions.
Я себя воспринимаю как социального историка и всегда бегу от политики, но постараюсь сформулировать, что я думаю об этом.
Myself as a social historian, I escape politics, but I'll try to formulate what I think about it.
То есть, что можно наблюдать непосредственно в Харькове? То есть я вижу через документы, через вот некоторые столкновения внутри общины. И вот я хотел бы сказать тут, почему я подчеркиваю, что я всегда называю община, да, или даже общины. То есть фактически документы, вот, да, с чем было связано вот то мое hidden community. Документы показывают наличие общины в конце 19 века, на рубеже 19-20 веков, то, чего, казалось бы, вообще быть не может, не должно быть.
So he says that he prefers to talk about the community or commune, because he does think that there was a certain commune at the end of 19th, beginning of 20th century. And there was, he found some traces of disagreements, so there are tensions within the community.
Я работал с таким комплексом документов, которые показывают судебное дело, вскрывающее буквально наличие хедеров, хаверот, духовного раввина и содержание вдовы прежнего духовного раввина. Ну, то, что казалось бы просто невозможно. Мне черты оседлости, и власть это отрицала, наличие подобного.
So he said that he worked with a set of documents, and I probably need Stephen's help here. What were the documents about? The
chinovniki, the bureaucrats. So
okay,
yeah, talking about the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Bureaucracy, that was, he says that seems like it wouldn't be possible to find those documents there outside of the Pale settlement.
И вот в этих столкновениях внутри общины, да, я вижу апелляции к властям, но просто опять для разных, да, частей даже этой общин или разных общин, я не знаю, как их так интерпретировать четко, власть не была врагом, да, это была своя власть, то есть они ее не воспринимали как врага в этом смысле.
And what he sees there, that the members of the community did not treat the government or the authorities as their enemy. They were not on the other side of it.
Но, тем не менее, я бы сказал, что вот в тот момент, наверное, когда, может быть, формируется русский национализм, хотя я это не исследовал специально, вот в последние 2 десятилетия 19 века, в Харькове, который русские националисты, да, считали вполне своим и чувствовали себя там очень спокойно, в отличие от Киева или Одессы. Вот этот дискурс определенный антисемитский, он уже присутствует.
So he talks about the rise of Russian nationalism and that a lot of those Russian nationalists felt very comfortable in Kharkiv in the way they didn't feel comfortable in other parts of Ukraine. And he says that the rise happened at the last 2 decades of the 19th century. Вы сказали, что они себя удобнее чувствовали в Харькове, да? В отличие
Да, то есть они чувствовали Харьков русским городом, да,
They
то,
felt
что
that
сейчас
Kharkiv
повторяют.
is a Russian city.
Да, точно.
И наоборот, да, получается, что Харьков конца вот 19 века, он для многих украинских деятелей, украинофилов, да, он уже представляется чужим, немного чужим.
And conversely, for Ukrainian intellectuals, the Ukrainophiles, Kharkiv felt an alien city, a foreign city.
Но это было их как бы восприятие по сравнению с тем, да, что они помнили, что в начале 19 века Харьков же наоборот был форпостом фактически украинского движения.
But they are reacting against the reality that in the beginning of the 19th century, they felt that it was a very Jewish city or a very Ukrainian city.
А тут классический пример, да, городской голова Гордиенко, да, который вот откровенный антисемит.
And here we have a situation that the head of the city, the main person in the city, Гордиенко, is an open anti-Semite.
Но также я вижу вот в жалобах как бы простых горожан о том, что они цитируют фактически такие, ну вот сочинения Осман-Бея, да, вот все популярные антисемитские, вот всю популярную антисемитскую литературу, она знакома местным антисемитам, и они ее цитируют в своих жалобах.
And on the other hand, the local anti-Semites quote well-known anti-Semitic literature like Osman Bey in their complaints.
И даже вот такие либеральные деятели, как Дмитрий Боголей, тоже еще один городской голова и автор, наверное, самой большой работы по истории Харькова когда-либо. Он тоже допускает вполне такие, то, что мы сегодня бы восприняли бы как антисемитские пассажи.
And even a more liberal representative of the government, Bogaley, who is one of the, or the author of one of the more complete histories of Kharkiv, he also mentions certain things that would be construed as anti-Semitic today.
Но что интересно, что параллельно с этим, да, в Харькове, в самоуправлении харьковском, очень сильно купеческое сословие. 80% харьковского купечества – это евреи.
He says that also in self-governing bodies of Kharkiv, merchants were extremely strong, and up to 80% of merchants were Jews.
И фактически как бы вот одно соседствует с другим, да, а антисемитская риторика никогда в Харькове не будет переходить к действиям.
And so two notions or two concepts or phenomena live side by side, and so the anti-Semitic rhetoric was never turned into action.
И я не говорю, что Харьков это такое толерантное общество и такой вот город уникальный, да, а я говорю о том, что это вот такое стечение обстоятельств, которое иногда не очень понятно.
He is not saying that Kharkiv is a specifically very tolerant city and just some kind of utopia, but rather it's a strange confluence of events.
Ну вот я, например, могу сказать вполне четко, почему не было вот тех так называемых погромов, да, в 1881 году.
But I can tell you for sure why there were no pogroms in 1881.
Фактически это такое жесткие действия местного генерал-губернатора Святополка Мирского, который призвал армию, и армия вот находилась наготове.
And that's because of the firm actions of the local general Святополк Мирский, who had the army on standby.
Он не был филосемитом, но он не хотел беспорядка в городе.
He was not specifically a Jewish-loving person, but he didn't want any disorder in the city.
Ну вот так, если я смог описать.
That's what I describe.
Спасибо. That's great. Thank you. I love the attention to contingency. That's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Well, thank you so much for wonderful questions, and I think a really stimulating conversation on a period of history and a place that is oftentimes not looked at as closely as I think it should be in our thinking about the Jewish experience in Eastern Europe. So thank you, Dr. Kharchenko, for your wonderful lecture and for being here today.
Thank you.
Really grateful, and we look forward to maybe after things settle down, we'll be able to host you again in person here in Austin at some point, we hope in the future. We wish you all the best and for safety for you and your family and everyone there. And we thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, friends. And extremely thanks, Marina, for your help.
Yes, and thank you, Dr. Alexandrova. Thank you so much. All right. Wish everyone a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.